All right, in this video, I want to talk about kiln development. And so I'm framing this as kiln development from earliest technologies to later technologies, but it's important to remember that all of these technologies are used today. Like, people pit fire today, people use updraft kilns, people use wood and gas and electric and all of these sorts of things. So when we talk about development, we're talking about the technology, but it not necessarily ancient history. So we talked before about pit fires, and so these would be firings not in kilns. And then we talked about how somebody like Maria Martinez would start to, or other kinds of pit firings might start to build up temporary walls, essentially. So temporary walls made out of fired ceramic or pieces of metal and stuff like that, those would be insulators that are essentially proto-kilns, right? They're starting to be kilns. And so next, when we see a semi-permanent kiln, which is, this picture is from Daniel Rhodes's book Kilns, but I chose this picture in part because I've made this kind of kiln before. I've made it with a group of people, and the top, actually, this top section in the kiln we made was something that was taken apart and put back together. So the bottom part of the kiln stays built, and the top part of the kiln is temporary. In this picture, the outside of the kiln is already built up, but they're putting the top on it each time they fire. So this is an updraft kiln, a type of kiln where you would put the, essentially lean in the top, not lean very far if the top isn't built, but lean in the top and put the work in the stuff inside there, and then build up the walls, potentially, and then cover it up. And you cover that up with pieces of fired ceramic, pieces of just wet clay that would get heated during the firing. And so then there's a space underneath that is the firebox. The fire, you essentially start a fire in the front here. You start pushing the fire inside, and the heat, the hot coals, and the fire burning wood are in the bottom and in the front here. And then the heat, of course, as we know, rises, and so the heat rises through the kiln. It's an updraft kiln because the heat goes in the bottom and comes out the top. It's a semi-permanent kiln because parts of the kiln essentially get taken apart as each time you work on it. And this kind of kiln develops into a more permanent kiln where essentially you don't take away those pieces. So I've got a screenshot here, and I'll share the video with you from this primitive-technology.wordpress. There's a YouTube video where he is essentially building a small version of what I just said there. So you have the firebox in the bottom, you have the pots. This is another tumble stack, which just means you don't have the stuff on shelves. It's just kind of stacked together. It looks like a mess, but they're balanced on each other so that they don't break. In his case, he's just got pieces of clay ceramic on the top to keep the heat in, and you can see the heat is coming out too. In this case, it's a more built-up kiln, and there's a flue opening damper across the flue, across the opening on the top that can be opened or shut to allow more or less air inside. So these, all three of the ones we've just, this one and these ones, these are all updraft kilns. They all have a firebox on the bottom. Two of them are semi-permanent, and this one is more permanent plan. So, and then those would be fired with wood for the most part. Wood kilns, when we say the word wood kiln, technically it means any kind of kiln. Any kiln fired with wood is a wood kiln. But this example here is a wood kiln that is also called an anagama, which just means a climbing kiln. This is when people in the U.S. say wood kiln, lots of times they mean this particular type of kiln that comes from Japan. And this is a climbing kiln, meaning that it angles up the hill. So if we look at this, it's a little hard to tell what you're looking at here. This one at the bottom is being made, and you can check out their website. I may put a direct link to it down below, where they're showing you the process of making it. But this wooden frame thing is holding up the wall while they build it. They're going to take that out to fire it. The kiln itself, you can actually walk into it or climb into it, just walk up into it. All this space is open for putting pots. These are usually pretty big kilns. And then there's a chimney at the back. This one has the same structure, bigger here it looks like, and then a climbing part here, and then a chimney in the back, and then they've built a structure over the top of it. Because these are permanent kilns. These are going to be used over and over again. Now let's look in the front of one of these types of kilns, and you can see that arched brick that builds the structure of the kiln. This stuff is stacked on shelves, as opposed to what we looked at here, where it's just kind of tumbled stacked together. The work is put on shelves, and if we look at a diagram on the side here, we can see how, because heat rises, the heat that's put in the front, we'll take a look at that in a moment, but heat is essentially pushed into, or fuel is tossed into the front. The work is in this section marked 3, and so the heat rises up through the kiln and then out the chimney here. And sometimes there's some side stoke holes. These openings are on the side, so you can add some different kinds of fuels and stuff. You can see that there's a few of those holes open that way. When you're firing this kiln, you usually brick up the front opening. So here's the arch that we saw in the other picture. The rest of these bricks that are not in an arch shape have been added after the kiln was loaded. And then they've left an opening here, a small opening, or fairly small opening, that they can cover with like a little door thing or a few bricks, depending if you've got a fancy door, and you're essentially just tossing wood in here. Now the reason people are interested in wood kilns is that during the firing the ash flies through the kiln and lands on all the pots, so you get a different look to the glaze and the ceramic surface. You can see on the bricks how they're kind of shiny. That's because they've been in a lot of firings. And we'll talk about atmosphere a little bit later. Right now we're talking about kiln types, like I said. And so another version of a climbing kiln is a wood-fired, again, would be a chambered climbing kiln. Noborigama is the Japanese name for it. And so these chambers, essentially, instead of having everything come up through a tube, now you have these separate sections, and there's a small opening between sections. There's also going to be an opening on the side. The fuel goes in the front, at the bottom. It cycles through the first kiln. It cycles through through the first chamber, through the second chamber. And the neat thing about this is you can have different atmospheres in different chambers. So when we talk about atmosphere in a little bit, we can talk about how much fuel or what kind of fuel is added to each chamber, as well as how much air is added. You can even add things like salt during a firing. That is going to change how the kiln, how the glazes and the clay or the ceramic looks. So we've got, just to review, we've got these semi-permanent updraft kilns of a couple of different types, or permanent updraft kilns. We've got anagama, climbing hill kilns, fired with, all of these so far fired with wood, and we've got climbing kilns. We call this a downdraft climbing kiln because the important thing is the heat goes in the bottom in any kind of wood-fired kiln that you're talking about, but then it'll come out the bottom again. So it goes up, comes out the bottom, as opposed to an updraft kiln where the heat goes in the bottom, comes out the top. Or here's a better, right? You see the heat coming right out the top, or the smoke and stuff. So I've got one more here to show you, and that is the gas kiln. And so this is YVC, it's old, YVC, not YVCC, whatever. But this is an old, this old video current kiln. So this is the kiln in the Palmer Martin building, and this is a car kiln, meaning that we've got tracks, and so we can basically wheel out the floor and the front wall all in one go, and then we can load it up. We can stand on both sides to load it. Just a little bit easier to load. It's a forced air kiln. So these ones all have natural air because when you put the fire in, air comes in, right? The fire needs air to burn. In this one, we have blowers that blow in air. It's natural gas. It's attached to a natural gas pipeline. And so we light the gas on fire, turn the air on, and shoot the air and gas combination into the kiln. The fuel then is gas. This is a downdraft kiln, and the reason for that is similar to the other one. The heat comes in at the bottom and it goes out at the bottom. So let's look at a downdraft and an updraft compared together. These are both similarly shaped kilns. In fact, these could be, they're not quite the same as our kiln at school, but it's pretty similar. In an updraft kiln over here, the heat goes in the bottom. In our kiln at school, we basically got little holes in the back of the kiln at the bottom that our burners and our air blowers point into. So we light that on fire, we shoot it in, whether that's gas or whether that's natural gas, propane, wood, whatever your fuel is that you're putting in, you put it in at the bottom. The heat rises. In both cases, the heat rises. In the updraft case, there's a hole at the top, and you can close up that hole or open it up to let more or less air in, but the air goes out the top. Done. In a downdraft kiln, the heat goes up, but there's no opening at the top. It's got to come back down, and this is the opening for the chimney. We can see the chimney's behind, not on top, right? And so the chimney or the flue is in the entrance for it, or the exit for that heat is at the bottom. This downdraft type of kiln is a little bit more efficient, and you tend to get a little bit more even firing inside the kiln, like the atmosphere and the amount of heat is more even because that air circulates, as opposed to just going up and through. Sometimes in an updraft kiln, depending how big the opening is here, you're going to get kind of a draft around here, or you might get some spots where the heat doesn't quite hit because it's on its way out already. So there is one other type so we're going to talk about reduction atmospheres in a moment, atmospheres in a moment, but I want to mention there are electric kilns that a lot of people fire. These are generally going to be their fuel, as if you call it that, is electricity. So you're not adding any fuel into them. The slide is off here, but the kiln is fired by electricity. There's no fuel added. There's generally not then the same kind of need for entrance and exit. The heat is all the way around, and it goes out, generally a vent at the bottom, sometimes some openings in the front. We also have a raku firing, a type of firing here that you can see that is fired. The type of kiln is also gas fired, but we do some other things when we take the work out of it. And we'll talk about that later.